James I is a Scottish king that spent 18 years in captivity in England as a kind of prisoner stroke guest. It's a very similar vibe that Travelodge has going. And while he was in captivity in England, the country's been run by his uncle, Robert, the Duke of Albany. Now, this is despite the fact that he almost certainly had arranged James' kidnap and was almost certainly responsible for the death of his brother David. He was running the place despite the fact that everyone knew that he was a murderer. He was kind of like Carol Baskin in that respect, I suppose. But Albany was actually a very competent ruler. He ruled using a council of nobles, kind of seen himself as first amongst equals. It's a bit like when a middle-class person shops in Lidl, you know. And by far the most significant event of Albany's reign was the Battle of Harlow, which was fought on the 24th of July, 1411. It was a battle between Highland and Lowland Scotland for the vacant earldom of Ross. An army of Highlanders led by Donald MacDonald, Lord of the Isles, as well as the Golden Arches. They made their way up the Great Glen. And MacDonald, he promised the clansmen unlimited plunder when they made their way to the undefended city of Aberdeen, which is a tad naive because, as everyone knows, any undefended plunder in Aberdeen is immediately snatched by the seagulls. Now, standing in his way was Alexander, the Earl of Mar, the son of the famous Wolf of Badenoch. And the Battle of Harlow, fought just outside Inverurie, is remembered for its ferociousness. There was no real kind of strategy. It was just two sides running at each other, a bit like an Edinburgh Derby, you know. And there was no clear winner, but Albany, he did manage to manoeuvre the situation so that the vacant earldom ended up in the hands of his son. It's a bit like a Tory MP when they're negotiating an NHS contract, you know. When Albany died in 1420, his son Murdoch, he became the Duke of Albany and the governor in the region of Scotland. Meanwhile, during this time, James is imprisoned in England and he falls in love with the beautiful Joan Beaufort. And he pens a very famous poem called The King's Quair. It's his undying love for Joan. And it's a very famous piece of literature. It's very culturally significant. And it's impressive it is for someone, a leader like that, to create something like that. There's no way that James could possibly have coped, you know, with like woman, person, man, camera, TV. Do you know what I mean? Like that's different stratosphere. That's that level, you know. And James, he was a brilliant writer. He was a talented musician. He was athletic. He was a keen horseman, archer, wrestler. He was kind of like Vladimir Putin, I suppose. And he was eventually released in December 1423 in the Treaty of London. And the Scots, they agreed to pay 10,000 merks a year along with 21 Scottish hostages in a kind of ISIS style of negotiation. James, he was married to Joan in a glittering ceremony in February 1424, and he was coronated at Scone on the 21st of May. And just the day after his coronation, he held a parliament at Perth where he passed a raft of legislation, most of it taxes on land and goods. But he also banned the playing of football, presumably after seeing how shite his countrymen were at it. He encouraged archery instead. He said at the parliament, and I quote, "Na man is to play at the football under pay of 4 pennies," which, you know, if you play for Ross County, that's a week's wages. Do you know what I mean? That's significant. And James's main motivation when he resumed control of his kingdom was to get revenge on the Albany Stuarts who had humiliated his father, Robert III, and killed his brother, David. And so a year later, in May 1425, he had Murdoch, the Duke of Albany, beheaded on the heading stone at Stirling Castle, along with his sons Walter and Alexander, and Walter's father-in-law, the Earl of Lennox. Now, the Scottish nobility, they seen this as being incredibly excessive and vindictive. These were the first public executions that had been ordered in over a century. And that, along with James's heavy taxation policies, meant that he was on a collision course with his nobles. But James, he was undoubtedly a good king. The first university in Scotland had been opened during Albany's reign at St Andrews, and James, he took a keen interest in its development, even attending lectures. But that's only because he couldn't get into the lectures at Oxford and Cambridge, you know. He installed a lot of civil courts and appeal courts, and he ensured that every man, woman and child had the right to a free trial and legal aid in Scotland. He even got everyone's PPI back. But he spent heavily on himself. He had witnessed the opulence of the English court and he wanted the same in Scotland. And he spent sums that the Scottish Crown had never seen before. James would do stuff like, for example, he would buy dishwasher tablets and toilet rolls when they weren't on offer. Do you know what I mean? He'd go into DFS and buy a sofa when it wasn't on the sale. Like if he was in the train station, he would use the toilets in the train station instead of waiting until he got on the train. Do you know what I mean? If he was out for a meal, he'd actually ask to see the wine list instead of just ordering the house wine. Like he'd fill up his royal carriage with super unleaded. You know, he built a glittering Renaissance palace at Linlithgow, and he had the whole thing lit by Yankee candles. It was just incredible opulence never seen in Scotland before. And towards the end of his reign, James was becoming less glamorous, and he was more seen as kind of mean, fat, and vindictive, a bit like Morrissey. And that, along with his heavy taxation policies and a disastrous attempt at retaking Roxburgh Castle and not dealing with the north of Scotland, it led to his assassination. James was assassinated on the 21st of February 1437 at Blackfriars Priory in Perth. James preferred Perth to Edinburgh as his royal capital, despite the fact that Perth didn't have a castle or didn't have a palace. The only thing that was protecting the priory was a ditch, which remains Perth's biggest tourist attraction to this day. So in the evening, a group of conspirators, they break into Blackfriars Priory. And James, hearing the commotion, he hides in a drain. He kind of Andy Dufresne's it. But unfortunately for him, he had the drain blocked to stop tennis balls from a tennis court escaping up it. It meant that his drains were more well protected than the drains at Shawshank. But it also means that James I is the only other Scotsman whom tennis has been more damaging to his body than Sir Andy Murray. The conspirators, they tore up the floorboards, they climbed into the drain, and they stabbed James I 16 times, just like I did the last time I had a plumber in after he gave me his quote for fixing my shower. Joan, she managed to escape wounded, and she made it to Edinburgh Castle with her 6-year-old son James, where she sent out folk to hunt down the conspirators. They were given a particularly brutal execution, even by medieval standards. And once again, Scotland had an infant on the throne. James II was crowned on the 25th of March, 1437 at Holyrood Palace, aged only 6 years old. And that is what I'm going to tell you about next time. Thanks for listening.